This might be the most obscure game I ever cover on this channel, and that says a lot since I'm planning to eventually cover a few WonderSwan games, the Klonoa games, and Kodelka. Have you ever heard of Kodelka? And if you have, did you know it's technically the first game in the Shadow Hearts series? My point is that I play quite a few obscure video games. I think it's fascinating to delve below the uber-popular surface-level AAA bestsellers and check out things that flew below the radar or otherwise occupy a niche that few people even know exists. And Radical Dreamers is such an interesting case study. Chrono Trigger is one of the most well-regarded RPGs of all time, and yet its first follow-up game was a Japan-exclusive text adventure that was only available for a short time on a convoluted and gimmicky add-on. In 1995, the Japanese Super Famicom received a satellite-based add-on peripheral in partnership with radio company Saint Giga, known as the Satellaview. The add-on was the result of Nintendo purchasing stakes in Saint Giga in an attempt to rescue the company from bankruptcy. The idea behind Satellaview was that Saint Giga would broadcast games via satellites, akin to a radio or television program, which players could access using their Super Famicom. The peripheral was notably marketed to a more adult audience, usually only sold via mail-in orders or at dedicated electronics stores, and customers would need to pay a minimum 6-month subscription fee to use the service. A requisite Satellaview cartridge was needed to boot the system up, as well as optionally a memory card unit if the player wanted to save their game. Moreover, using the Satellaview required it be hooked up to an AV splitter, satellite tuner, and satellite dish all at the same time. It's really no wonder the thing never caught on. Satellaview games would sometimes even be accompanied with live commentary from celebrities or radio personalities, and Nintendo would occasionally host game tournaments on the service. Overall, though, Nintendo largely sees the add-on as a flop, and much of its library is now considered lost media due to its satellite broadcast nature. And this was the landscape of gaming in which Radical Dreamers was released, probably one of the most high-profile Satellaview games in terms of preservation efforts. Despite how beloved Chrono Trigger would prove to be, there have only been 3 entries in the franchise, including Radical Dreamers. Thus, the game does hold a certain significance in that regard. Until very recently, it's mostly been up to fans to keep the game from going extinct over the years, via unofficial translations and emulation efforts. Radical Dreamers is a classic text-based adventure game. All of the story, dialogue, and gameplay choices are presented through written paragraphs, accompanied by pre-rendered background sprites, ambient music, and environmental sound effects. Moving graphics are rare and typically reserved for key story moments or transitions. The story follows a trio of thieves, Surge, Kid, and McGill, as they infiltrate the manor of Lord Lynx in an attempt to steal the Frozen Flame, a mystical artifact said to grant wishes. Kid has ulterior motives as well, seeking to take revenge on Lynx for burning down the orphanage in which she was raised. The mysterious McGill also seems to have motives of his own, but neither Surge nor Kid have any idea what those may be. Surge is the character we control, but I wouldn't call him a player avatar. Being the point-of-view character, he narrates the adventure and has a predefined personality and backstory, with the player's choices simply driving the plot along through various minor divergences and even slightly alternate endings. The player has 2 invisible gauges that the game is tracking at all times, their HP and their level of affection with Kid. As you traverse Viper Manor, you may randomly encounter monsters roaming its halls, with battles also presented in a text-based format. The choices you make during these battles will determine how deftly you fend the enemies off, although there is an element of randomness to some of the outcomes, and hesitating to make any choice will result in you taking additional damage. Behaving certain ways during fights will also affect Kid's opinion of you, which will in turn change the way she treats Surge during story scenes, and can even affect which ending you ultimately get. Enemies can occasionally drop items after battle as well that will affect one of these 2 values, either recovering some HP or increasing Kid's affection for you. But otherwise, you have to be very mindful of these stats. HP is only healed at 2 or 3 points in the story, and there's only a limited number of opportunities to get on Kid's good side. The game doesn't have any visible HUD or gauges to keep track of either value. Instead, after each battle, Surge will remark on his injuries and Kid will make comments, and you can also return to the Manor's terrace and speak with Kid or McGill to have them remark on your current levels. But these context clues are the only indicators you get. There's also no in-game map of any kind. As you explore Viper Manor, you just have to memorize the layout in your mind or map it out yourself on a sheet of paper. Nowadays, you'd never see a video game attempt to get away with this, but this was something that I really enjoyed in this context. The manor consists of 2 main floors with only a few branches and a small basement, and once I had seen everything the game had to offer, I knew the floor plan like the back of my hand. As you explore the various rooms, you trigger different story events and gather information on where to find keys or how to solve puzzles, and which areas you need to visit to move on. Text adventures are a classic and well-established genre, even back then, so this one had a lot to take influence from, and it does so very well. At no point did the game feel too obtuse nor too straightforward, and the main story was only around 3 or 4 hours long in total. Not short enough to feel lacking, but not long enough to overstay its welcome. Of course, this total playtime may vary depending on how efficiently you manage to navigate the manor and figure out everything you need to do. If I'm being honest though, random battles really don't seem to translate well to a fully text-based format. Each type of enemy encounter offers the same correct choices every time, but even if you make the right choices, you can still get a bad outcome due to an internal dice roll, so to speak. In other words, choosing the correct options only increases your chance of success. It's never a guarantee. The Griffin enemy is the worst in this regard, as it's the only enemy type in the game where there are no correct answers, and success or failure is always completely random. During one required boss battle, I used a walkthrough to choose all the right options and still managed to get bad rolls on nearly every one of them. This all works perfectly fine in tabletop RPGs, where you have physical dice that you can physically see that will physically inform you of how well your choice panned out. Here, though, it makes it difficult to problem solve and learn from your failure when it's impossible to tell if a bad outcome was due to poor decision making or just bad luck. And the amount of repeating text in this game makes the random battles a chore by the end. There are 8 different possible enemy encounters, but each one plays out the same way each time, with the same exact paragraphs describing the same exact events and offering the same exact options. Moreover, through all of my playthroughs, I never actually saw all 8 enemies in the same run. It always seemed like the game would just pick 2 at random and repeat those the whole time. This meant I was seeing a lot of the same paragraphs and text prompts over and over, sometimes showing the same prompt twice in a row if I got a bad outcome. And the more you get lost when navigating the manor, the more random encounters you risk running into. Like I mentioned earlier, every battle is also followed by dialogue that is meant to inform you what your current health and affection levels are. And the game will show you those paragraphs even if those values haven't changed. This can sometimes result in seeing the same page of text a half dozen times or so, and you cannot skip text in this game. In contrast, there were 1 or 2 runs of the game where it felt like I wasn't running into any encounters at all, which made me wonder what the point of them was to begin with. While I wouldn't necessarily describe Radical Dreamers as a horror game, its overall tone is definitely horror adjacent. It takes place entirely within one building, with dark, grimy corridors and chilling ambient music accompanying the text, and the story has a foreboding, macabre vibe to it. Around nearly every corner, the game is written with an underlying sense of dread and unease. It's all very bleak. The narration gets quite detailed and visceral at times, with a particular random encounter against a horde of leeches nearly making my stomach turn. According to writer Masato Kato, the game was meant to lean even more into being straight-up horror, but this was toned down in light of Resident Evil releasing around the same time, to which Kato felt Radical Dreamers had too similar a premise. The story of Radical Dreamers is allegedly set in the world of Chrono Trigger, although this isn't made obvious at first, with most of the reveals coming in the game's final act. In fact, in advertising the game, Square and Nintendo made no mention of Chrono Trigger whatsoever. But by the end of the story, it's made fairly clear that you've actually been playing a surprise sequel. The town of Por is mentioned by name, as is the Masamune, and the Chrono Trigger itself plays a key role in the story's finale. They also make allusions to both Lavos and the Kingdom of Zeal, and it's heavily implied by story's end that McGill is in fact Magus in disguise, still searching for Shala, who, as it turns out, has actually been reincarnated as Kid herself. Nevertheless, I'd argue Radical Dreamers is still perfectly friendly to newcomers. You don't actually need to have played Chrono Trigger to understand anything in this game. It's all mostly explained for you. That being said, I personally find the ties to Trigger's plot a bit trite. Masato Kato felt that Chrono Trigger's plot left some things unresolved, and he sought to address those things here. But I'd argue the only thing left truly unresolved in Trigger was the fate of Shala. And in the grand scheme of things, that didn't really matter. We didn't really need to know what happened to her or where Magus went after the game was over, nor did we need to know exactly how the Chrono Trigger works. The only character from Trigger who is referenced by name is Luca, in the very same breath wherein it's revealed she was murdered in cold blood off-screen between games. Which seems kinda mean-spirited, doesn't it? And moreover, the story's last-minute pivot to wrapping up plots left over from Chrono Trigger ends up making the whole thing feel kinda shallow. What starts off as an intriguing, self-contained horror drama ends up feeling like it only existed to tie up the Shala plotline. There was no real point to it. There are no strong underlying themes, no interesting subtext, and the characters didn't even really grow by the end of it all. The story makes note that Kid has finally learned who she is, but that was never really an aspect of her character up to that point. She wasn't seeking answers or a sense of identity, she just wanted revenge. And in fact, her quest for revenge seems to have had no negative consequences whatsoever. I think this is what happens when you make a Chrono Trigger story without the Dream Team involved. We at least had Yasunori Mitsuda return to compose the music, going for a much more subdued and ambient vibe that fits really well, but Sakaguchi, Hori, and Toriyama had absolutely nothing to do with this one, and neither did Takashi Tokida for that matter. Masato Kato, who worked as a conceptual writer and artist on Chrono Trigger, was fully in charge of this game's story and direction, and he admits to having a somewhat nihilistic outlook on things at that point in his life. This darker, more cynical tone is what we got when Masato Kato was let off his leash. And no offense to the man, but I can't say I'm a huge fan of the direction he ultimately took things. It's all written very competently, and it definitely has its moments. Like, the fact that the game made me feel sad about a mirror dying tells me that they were still doing something right. But the game's story is at its most interesting when it isn't trying to tie back to Chrono Trigger. The writing also puts a questionable focus on objectifying Kid for some reason. Most of the humor in the game comes from characters commenting on her appearance, and Surge sometimes spends entire paragraphs at a time ogling her, remarking on her weight, her eyes, her lips, that kind of thing. The game even rewards good battle performance by having Kid kiss Surge in celebration. If I were still a teenager myself, I'd probably be fine with all this, but as an adult, I was cringing at some of this stuff, and making it weirder is that Surge's age is left somewhat nebulous. Kid is very clearly said to be 16 years old. Meanwhile, Surge is described as being a traveling musician who met Kid a few years ago. It's implied through context clues that he is also an adolescent, which would put him anywhere between 10 and 19 by most definitions, but he at one point mentions that he was writing music long before he ever met Kid, so what, was this dude writing songs when he was like 9 years old, or is this a guy in his 20s thirsting over a teenager? The fact that she's literally named Kid also makes it just that extra bit weirder. I get that Kato probably just picked a name he thought sounded cool, but the actual meaning of it adds some unfortunate implication to the whole thing. And while I'm at it, the title Radical Dreamers is also kind of nonsense, right? A well-worn and oft-mocked trope of Japanese media is that they'll often just pick two random English words and stick them together because they think it sounds exotic or interesting, without actually putting much thought into what the words actually mean. Radical Dreamers is a great example of that. Neither of those words have anything to do with the plot of the game. If I remember right, Chrono Cross would clarify that this trio of characters call themselves the Radical Dreamers, but that doesn't make the phrase actually mean anything. Who is dreaming? Why is said dreaming being done radically? How does one dream radically, exactly? Just like in Chrono Trigger, when you finish the story the first time, New Game Plus is unlocked and offers you the chance to branch off from the main story to discover alternate plot lines and endings. The game has 7 main endings in total, with 2 of those offering additional variants depending on factors such as Kid's opinion of you or specific story decisions you made. Each alternate ending is justified within the game itself as being alternate dimensions, which in some ways sets up for the plot and setting of Chrono Cross. A few of these New Game Plus stories are played relatively straight, but most of them are meant to be comedic, such as one where Lynx is revealed to be an alien, and McGill is an intergalactic police officer slash rock star named Mick Van Jovi, complete with the end credits' usual birds being swapped out for UFOs. There's one ending where the story plays out mostly as normal, but with a giant mecha battle replacing the usual confrontation with Lynx. One ending even seems to kinda sorta be a nod to Final Fantasy IV. But the most bizarre story path, and probably my least favorite if I'm being honest, is the one where Kid is transformed into a giant naked monster by a lecherous sunflower. Yep, more weird objectifying of a teenager. According to Kato, that scenario was written by Makoto Shimamoto, with Kato noting that he, quote, stayed far away from that particular episode. Development of Radical Dreamers was very rushed, being completed in just 3 months, and that was after the team managed to talk their way up from 2 months. In interviews since, Masato Kato has described the game as being unfinished, but cites it as the project that helped solidify his writing style. Ultimately, the plot of Radical Dreamers would go on to help form the basis of Chrono Cross, also written largely by Kato. Surge, Kid, and Lynx all reappear in reimagined fashion as major characters, and a chapter of Cross's story is essentially a retelling of the events of Radical Dreamers. Alas, the very nature of the Satellaview means the game was never going to see a widespread release of any kind, leaving it up to fans to hunt down a ROM file and take matters into their own hands. And that's exactly what happened in 2004, when ROM hacking group Demiforce would release a fan translation of Radical Dreamers for standard SNES emulators. In a game that's 90% text, it's important that the translation be more than up to snuff, and fortunately, the Demiforce gang absolutely knocked it out of the park. This is one of the most exceptional fan translations I've ever seen, even now, and especially back in 2004. Great choice of font, first of all, it contrasts against the backgrounds perfectly, but moreover, the tone of the script is appropriate and respectful of the source material, but never comes off as too direct or flat. It's got a real sense of personality. They do stick in some cheeky pop culture references here and there, but they're subtle and unobtrusive, some to the point where I can't even be sure if they are a reference or not. It's all very tastefully done, and with the fan translation being written after the release of Chrono Cross, it meant they were even able to incorporate elements from that game's official localization, such as Kid's Australian accent. The fan translators even added 2 secret bonus endings to the game that were not there originally. The first is a simple music test screen, while the second is an extended reference to the notoriously awful Zero Wing translation, one of the world's earliest internet memes, complete with Lynx being called cats. Now, some might say this was overstepping their bounds a bit. After all, it's not the translator's place to try to add to or improve on an existing work, but given this is an unofficial fan work to some extent, I thought it was all fine. I imagine to some younger folk the bonus ending will probably be incomprehensible, but for an old head like me, seeing the all your base scene recreated here did give me a chuckle. Radical Dreamers would remain in its niche of gaming culture for quite some time, as is the case with most Satellaview games. Square actually made plans to re-release Radical Dreamers a few times, first as a bonus feature with the PS1 port of Chrono Trigger in 1999, and again with the DS re-release in 2008. Both times, however, the idea would be halted by Kato himself, as he found himself unhappy with how the game turned out, saying that the game would need to be completely revised. In 2022, though, history would be made when Radical Dreamers would, in fact, finally be re-released. It was included in Chrono Cross The Radical Dreamers Edition, complete with an official English translation for the first time ever, meaning this obscure, lost sequel to Chrono Trigger has never been easier to get your hands on. Funny, sometimes the only thing standing in the way of games preservation is game publishers themselves. Now release the OVA on Blu-ray, you cowards!